Cada dia the Apache would wake before the sun broke through the horizon, before the birds found their voice in the quiet sky, before the world seemed alive, and in the silence of dawn he carried with him a small gift, a piece of bread, still warm, and a jar of milk, still fresh, and he walked through the dirt paths of his small village to the little house at the edge of the canyon where a woman lived, forgotten by many and seen by few. Her name was Rosa, though most people no longer remembered it, because Rosa had long been considered cursed, an outsider among her own, a widow whose husband had been taken by the drought and the sickness that swept through the valley years ago, leaving her with no children, no family, and no one to knock on her door. The Apache, whose real name was Noel, had never been one to judge people by whispers or shadows of the past. He believed that silence often carried stories that no one else dared to listen to, and in Rosa's silence, he had once seen eyes filled with hunger, not just for food but for compassion, for a hand to remind her that she was not invisible. That was why, every single day without fail, Noel brought bread and milk to her door. He never said much, just nodded, placed the offerings gently on the old wooden bench outside, and walked away before Rosa could muster words of gratitude. In her heart, Rosa wondered why. Why would a man of strength, a warrior respected by his people, spend his mornings remembering someone the world had chosen to forget? The truth was, Noel had known hunger himself as a child. He had grown up in winters where food was scarcer than dreams, and he remembered the ache in his mother's eyes when she had nothing to give him. He had learned that hunger was more than the emptiness of the stomach, it was the emptiness of the soul when kindness was absent. So when he saw Rosa, frail and fading, he recognized that emptiness and decided to fill it, quietly, faithfully, without expectation of anything in return. Day after day, Rosa began to wait for those footsteps. At first, she resisted, ashamed of her need, telling herself she would refuse the bread, that she didn't deserve such mercy. But hunger breaks down pride in ways that nothing else can, and slowly she accepted it, her trembling hands clutching the bread like a lifeline. Yet what surprised her most was not the food, but the feeling that someone saw her, truly saw her, in a world where she had vanished like a ghost. One morning, after weeks that turned into months, Rosa opened her door just as Noel was leaving. Their eyes met, and for the first time she whispered, "Thank you." It was barely more than a breath, but it carried years of unspoken pain. Noel nodded, not because he wanted her gratitude, but because he wanted her to know she was not alone. The seasons passed, and the ritual continued. Bread and milk became symbols of something larger, quiet gestures that stitched life back into Rosa's spirit. Her cheeks regained color, her eyes found light, and she began to tend to the small garden behind her house again, planting flowers where weeds had once grown, as if kindness had watered the soil of her soul. But one day, as Noel arrived, he noticed Rosa sitting on the bench waiting for him. She looked frightened than usual, her hands trembling not from hunger but from something deeper. "Noel," she said, calling him by his name for the first time. "Why do you do this? Why do you care for me when no one else does?" Noel sat beside her, the bread and milk between them, and for the first time he spoke more than a few words. "Because once, someone cared for me when no one else did. And it saved me. I do this so you know that you still matter." Tears welled in Rosa's eyes. She had believed her life no longer had value, that she was a burden, forgotten by time. But in that moment she realized kindness had resurrected her worth. From then on, their mornings changed. Rosa began preparing a place at the bench, sometimes offering Noel a seat, sometimes sharing stories of her youth, of the laughter that once filled her home, of the music her husband used to play on a wooden flute. Noel listened, not out of pity, but because he genuinely cared. And Rosa, in return, began to see him not just as the man who brought bread and milk, but as a friend, a companion in her twilight years. But the greatest change came one morning when Noel arrived without the bread and milk. Rosa, worried, asked why he had come empty-handed. Noel smiled softly and said, "Because today, Rosa, I have something greater to give you." From his chest he pulled not an object, but words that had been growing inside him for months. "You once asked why I care. The truth is, each day I gave you bread and milk, I also gave you pieces of my heart. And somewhere along the way, I realized that my heart no longer belonged to me, it belonged to you." Rosa gasped, her frail body trembling with emotions she thought she would never feel again. Love, at her age, had seemed impossible. Yet here it was, pure and steady, not born of youth or desire, but of compassion, respect, and shared humanity. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "No one has ever loved me like this." Noelle reached for her hand, weathered by time, and held it gently. "Then let me be the first, and the last, to love you in this way." That day, Rosa didn't just receive bread and milk, she received a heart, a promise that she would never again be forgotten, that her life still held meaning. For Noelle, it was not pity but purpose, not obligation but devotion. And though their story was quiet, unknown to the world, it carried a message louder than any song. That true love is not about grandeur, but about the courage to see another soul, to nourish it, and to give without expectation. In the months that followed, Rosa's health weakened, yet her spirit soared higher than it had in years. With Noelle by her side, she faced each day with peace. And when the time came for her to leave this world, she left not as a forgotten widow, but as a woman who had been deeply loved. Noelle mourned her, but he also smiled through his tears, because he knew that in giving her bread and milk, he had given her hope, and in giving her his heart, he had given her eternity. And in return, Rosa had taught him the greatest truth of all, that the smallest acts of kindness can transform into the purest forms of love, and that sometimes, feeding the body can awaken the soul. Their story remained untold by history books, but it lived on in the whispers of the canyon wind, a timeless reminder that compassion is the language that binds us all, and that love often begins with the simplest of gifts: bread, milk, and a heart willing to give itself away.